Chinese company Landspace has launched their Falcon 9 scale rocket for the very first time, and they even attempted a landing of the booster back on Earth. Unfortunately, however, they didn't quite stick the landing. But this isn't the only Chinese rocket attempting reusability, because there's 2 more vehicles lined up for launch very soon. First, let's introduce you to the rocket. This is Juche 3. Standing at 66 meters in height, this 4.5 meter diameter vehicle is slightly shorter but slightly fatter than SpaceX's Falcon 9, which has become the workhorse of Western spaceflight. But once you get beyond the landing legs, grid fins and number of engines, the similarities stop there. Juche 3 is a methalox rocket, meaning it uses methane for its fuel and oxygen for its oxidizer. And this is propellant that Landspace is very used to. Their precursor vehicle, Juche 2, made history as the first rocket to make orbit utilizing methalox back in 2023. They're also very familiar with the power plant. Juche 2's first stage is powered by 4 Tianqi 12 engines, and on Juche 3 they increased this to 9 engines. Capable of producing 658 kilonewtons of thrust at sea level, this pegs it slightly behind fellow methalox engine Archimedes, which Rocket Lab says is capable of 730 kilonewtons. Both, however, are trumped by the Carolox Merlin 1D behind the Falcon 9 Block 5, which comes in at 845. Those 9 TQ-12A engines propelled the stainless steel vehicle away from Site 96B at the Zhoushan Satellite Launch Center on a southeasterly trajectory. Following a successful ascent, those engines then shut off at 129 seconds into flight, allowing for stage separation. At this point, the booster started to maneuver to prepare for its re-entry back into the Earth's atmosphere. The landing attempt wasn't a return to launch site profile, it was a downrange profile, but it didn't include a drone ship, barge, or any marine assets for that matter. The Zhoushan Satellite Launch Center is located 1,500 kilometers, nearly 1,000 miles from the sea at its closest point, and along today's flight path, it's actually 2,500 kilometers away. Therefore, Landspace took advantage of what has historically been a disadvantage to Chinese spaceflight credibility. They constructed a landing zone on land 390 kilometers downrange. In fact, this satellite imagery is from July 13th, when it was still under construction. Targeting a landing site is definitely a much more moral choice compared to the status quo of dumping hypergolic stages on innocent villagers. The mission profile for this first flight saw 2 more burns. First up was the re-entry burn at T+6 minutes and 11 seconds, which saw 3 TQ-12s reignite in a line, very reminiscent of Falcon 9 and New Glenn. The purpose of this burn is to fight fire with fire, or in other words, slow the vehicle down to prevent it from experiencing a thermal regime too great for its structure to handle. This burn was scheduled to last 46 seconds, which is almost 20 seconds longer than the re-entry burn we see on a typical Falcon 9 Starlink mission. It's likely that Landspace were being extra conservative to increase their chances of bringing the booster home on the first flight. We assume that this progressed well, meaning that there was just one more burn to go, the landing burn. During the process of trying to reignite the 3 TQ-12s at T+8 minutes flat, the booster appeared to suffer an anomaly. This blazing fireball then impacted the ground just about 8.5 minutes after departing Zhoushan. An aerial photo shared on social media afterwards, however, shows this fireball mere meters away from the center of the landing zone. Landspace got incredibly close. A huge congratulations to them, because if that landing burn stuck, I'm pretty sure they would have nailed that landing. While the booster was doing its thing, the second stage was igniting its Tianqi 15A engine. It's a pattern you might be getting familiar with at this point, but Landspace already has experience with this engine, flying it on 3 flights of the Juche 2 enhanced variant, 2 of which have been successful to date. This second stage burn continued until 8 minutes and 29 seconds into flight when the TQ-15 cut off. At this point, Landspace officially declared mission success. There were rumours prior to the flight that it would be carrying a prototype of the Haolong cargo spaceplane. However, based on the mission timeline, this looks unlikely, and there's a possibility that it might not have been ready to fly in time. Last year, the entire nation of China launched under half the number of times as the entire United States, but every single one of those Chinese launches was with a newly built rocket. Think about it. They launched 68 times, they couldn't reuse any boosters, which means they had to build 68 individual first stages from scratch. But given the reusable capabilities of SpaceX, despite building half the number of first stages, the US managed to launch over twice as much. That just goes to show that when you throw some reusable boosters in the mix, suddenly you only have to build second stages and the fairings, and the flight rate can ramp up to stratospheric heights. Well, hopefully much higher than the stratosphere. I guess that idiom doesn't really work in this context. Juche 3 is not the only partially reusable vehicle of this size preparing for launch from China. In fact, multiple are getting ready as you watch this video. The vehicle currently slated to be the next to fly is the government Changzheng 12A. It's manufactured by the Shanghai Academy of Spaceflight Technology, which is a subsidiary of the state-owned China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, or CASC. Very similar in size to the Juche 3, it stands at approximately 69 meters tall and 3.8 meters in diameter, making it ever so slightly shorter and ever so slightly fatter than the Falcon 9. Identical to Juche 3 is its propellants, utilizing methane and oxygen on both stages. In name, it's actually an evolution of a pre-existing expendable vehicle, the Changzheng 12. This, however, uses kerosene instead of methane on both stages, has different engines to account for this propellant difference, and is about 7 meters shorter. The current rumoured launch date for this rocket is December 2025, and like the Juche 3, it is also attempting to land the first stage on the very first flight. The next reusable rocket preparing for launch has actually already launched. Yep, this is Space Pioneer's Tianlong 3, the first stage of which broke free from its test stand in June 2024, turning a static fire very much into a dynamic fire. Standing at 71 meters tall and 3.8 meters in diameter, Tianlong 3 is a Kerolox rocket with 9 engines on its first stage and 1 on its second. This makes it the closest rocket China has to the Falcon 9, being within a meter of its height, 10 centimeters of its diameter, and it uses the exact same propellant and engine count. The first flight of this medium-lift launch vehicle is currently on the books for a debut in 2025, although realistically that could slip into next year. This maiden flight, or I suppose intentional maiden flight, is not planning to feature a booster landing, however. Unfortunately, a lot of these organisations in China don't really say much, which makes it extremely difficult to figure this stuff out from the outside. A few companies are starting to publish information onto Western social media though. For example, Landspace has an account on X, and so does our next company, CASSpace. They're developing a rocket which looks aesthetically similar to SpaceX's Falcon Heavy, but in flight, it couldn't behave more differently. Meet the Lishan 2. Just like the Tianlong 3, it uses Kerolox propellant, but is much shorter at 52 meters in height. And yep, those are 3.35 meter diameter common booster cores for the first stage. But they aren't planning to detach separately. These 3 boosters will separate from the second stage as one complete unit, and then fly back to Earth and land on a landing pad as one whole unit. If that boggled your mind, stick with me, because CASSpace has thought of something even bigger. A heavy variant. Named the Lishan 2H, this will feature 5 common boosters, which again will fly back as a single whole unit. I suppose why have one stage when you could have 5? Unfortunately, it's going to be a few years before we see that happen though, because just like Space Pioneer, CASSpace isn't planning to recover the boosters on the first few flights. We should expect that to come online no earlier than 2028. And that's not all of the Chinese commercial rockets in development. There is a great number of vehicles from just as many companies, all vying to be the cheapest and most appealing launch provider possible. If this isn't evidence that China is accelerating its spaceflight efforts, then I don't know what is. Alongside the numerous medium, heavy and super heavy class reusable rockets getting ready for launch in the United States, 2026 is going to be a pivotal year on both sides of the Pacific, as each nation sets their sights on our orbital neighbour, the Moon. I've been Ryan Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.